My name is Noah Norman. I run a company called Hard Work Party, where I make digital objects and installations and experiences with complex inner lives. I've been using TouchDesigner for about 14 years, and I help run the TouchDesigner Discord. It's been a while since my last talk, and I'm kind of nervous, but I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy this is the first event and that so many of you came out, and I'm hoping we can get these going more often in the future. The thing I want to talk to you tonight about is essence. I don't have a title for this talk, and I don't even really have a single topic, but I've been working through some stuff, and hopefully it's going to be helpful for you to hear me do that out loud. So essence, I've been thinking a lot about how we find it. One of the things that all new media installation work has in common with other art is that when it's good, it's kind of a perfect expression of its own ideal. And that sounds a little bit like a tautology, but it's not, because art is inevitably self-referential. Even art that's hostile to the viewer is made with the viewer in mind. But the world of art is wide open, so you can make art out of anything, to say anything at any scale. So how do we find the right thing to make? How do we pick the medium and the arrangement and the execution that best evoke the message, or the other way around? In making new media art, we have this problem opportunity more than maybe other artists, because for a lot of us, with each piece, we're starting from scratch, and simultaneously or iteratively, alternatingly, we're picking our subject and our medium back and forth. TouchDesigner doesn't provide many constraints in this regard. That's one of the things that makes it so special. I took the time to box all of the operators in the new op creation dialog that could be involved in going in or out of TouchDesigner, physically or software-wise. This is, again, one of the things that makes TouchDesigner special. I have a tendency to start on this, and then I get caught in a loop where I just end up focusing on the thought of the viewer, wondering what I'm thinking, and I end up making work that's just about the viewer. Anyway, you might recognize the term gradient descent from the way we train machine learning models. It's a way to inch your way through hyperparameter space looking for the optimal configuration for minimizing a given loss function. Put another way, it's a method for finding the best settings for a ton of variables at once. That might be close to home, for those of you working in generative systems, for example. But in this case, I'm using parameter to refer to anything you can change about the work, including the medium of the work itself. So you do this by changing your parameters a tiny bit and then checking the outcome. If it's better, you keep going in that direction. If it's worse, you might go the other way. So you watch this, let's say low is good, right? Okay, so this is just a very simple two-parameter system. The parameters being where on this plane are we, and let's say x, z space, because we're TouchDesigner users, x, z space, where y, a high y is bad and a low y is good. So this is some solution to this two-parameter problem heading down to an optimal configuration. And it's just inching its way around one step at a time, going better like this, better like this, better like this, until it reaches something that seems to be optimal for the area. This is a formal algorithm for searching complex topologies for optimal conditions. Recently, I've been doing a lot of design. Specifically, I've been working on a startup called Third Wave. We're creating a next-generation immersive arcade experience. These are room-scale games designed de novo from a blank sheet of paper. And because we've iterated on this idea many times already, I've invented and reinvented dozens of games in Sketch, in Previs, in Prototype. And because this has involved some fundraising, I've had a lot of reps on communicating these changing ideas to different kinds of people. But it wasn't until recently that I realized how much difficulty I have communicating a design philosophy I believe in at my core. It's the one that I think is most heavily weighted in this kind of gradient descent design I'm consciously and unconsciously doing. And maybe that's because I've never really had to articulate it so many times in so many different ways. And it may be because I've never had to speak to my own vision so broadly. I've spent my career pitching one-off ideas or revisions to ideas, but I've never had the opportunity to just pitch my vision in the abstract. It's this vision, it's this design philosophy that's the heart of my belief in Third Wave, and I'm going to try to articulate it here. So when you're painting or you're sculpting from marble or writing a poem or a song, you're generally not making a lot of choices about the medium. But in new media and mixed media, the choice of what you make your work out of can be, at least in the beginning, completely open-ended. And in the process of choosing the medium, the embodiment or the vehicle for the work can be in dialogue with what the work actually is, or the content of the work. To be more concrete, for a simplified example, you might think, I really want to make something that evokes the feeling of being underwater. And so you might say, let me look into displays that fill your field of view. And then you might come across a great display that works for X, Y, or Z technical or budget reasons. I don't know why this would work. But you might come to realize, digging into it, that it does a shit job of, let's say, displaying like deep blue colors. But it's great at doing light blue colors. And that gives you the idea, you know what, this would be more effective anyway if it was about being in the sky, right? And so now you're working on a different idea, one that's a little bit of your original intent, and one that's informed by your choice of medium. I can't tell you how many projects I've worked on where the choice of medium was fixed at the outset, and the stakeholders refused to change their idea to suit, or vice versa. Even a seemingly tiny change can dramatically change the balance between the medium and the concept or the content. I think the best new media work rhymes. I think that if you're not considering the medium as part of your work, you're doing it wrong. The best ideas feel obvious or inevitable in a way where the medium and the content are inseparable, such that you'd more or less ruin them by changing anything. And it turns out there's a word for this that I learned while reading a novel this week. It's kineticity. And that's the skillful and harmonious arrangement of fitting together the different parts of something. This example is a project that I worked on. I was pitching for a while transparent LCD diorama ideas. This medium, the transparent LCD, is not all that different from a normal LCD, except in a normal LCD, there's a polarizer and a backlight that are right behind the LCD. So it's a sandwich that's very tight. And when you want to show white, the LCD goes transparent and it allows the white backlight through. In a transparent LCD, the backlight and the polarizer are gone or way back, and there's an illuminated box, a diorama behind the thing typically, where if you go show white on the screen, you can see through into the box. I had been pitching, this is a history, it was a history experience, an exhibition for a company that has a long storied history, and they wanted to tell that story through little kind of dioramas. And the idea that I was really attached to was the idea that this huge box, I mean, this thing's an 80-inch diagonal display, very large box, very deep cavity inside. I was really attached to the idea that you could, I thought we were going to get one more there. I was really attached to the idea that if the timeline itself were kind of chutes and ladders, sinuous, kind of snaking every which way, and we zoomed in tight on the timeline, that you could lose track as you navigated this interactive timeline of which parts of the box you had seen and which you hadn't seen yet. Because I think the strength of this medium is peekaboo. I think it's like not being able to know what's going to pop up behind the screen. It's revealing and hiding. Very simply, I think that's what this does better than a normal LCD, which can reveal something inside of it. But as you can see, I lost that battle, and what we ended up doing was a grid. And it was very, very easy to keep track of what you had seen and what you hadn't seen. And the thing that I was really attached to about this idea fell away, and it became something that I thought was, I'm proud of it, but I thought it was broken. Anyway, so this is a weird thing we're doing when we're making these choices. You're not dragging in much legacy baggage, and things are wide open. You have tons of parameters, and it's unclear how they're related or what exactly will happen when you make a change. Algorithmically, there's a lot of different ways of addressing this while not, testing absolutely everything. You could, let's say there's two parameters. You could sample regularly at even intervals. You could try a randomized layout and try to see which parameters matter. But I was hoping by this point in the talk that I'd figured out something about how I feel my way around this early part of the process, but I haven't. Regardless, I don't know how applicable my personal process would be to your situation. Honestly, I think it's pretty intuitive and vibes-based anyway. I seem to get a lot of ideas within moments of starting these sorts of projects, and I can't say where they come from. But what I can help with is the mid to late game part of this process. Regardless of how you're sampling, you're going to run into the risk of getting trapped in a local minimum. In machine learning, that's a suboptimal setting of parameters that nonetheless compares favorably to all the adjacent settings, and thus for gradient descent of a sufficiently fine grain, and I say fine grain because if you were hopping big coarse hops, you would find your way down here. It seems to be the best solution, even though there could be something better just a hop away. This is the point of the random sampling idea that we talked about a second ago, but I'm trying to formally institute techniques to avoid this happening in my own process and take into account the tendency to take for granted the decisions that you've already made. It's an issue you might call design fixation or anchoring bias. This is all I could find with permissive rights for images about bias. But I've been trying to pay attention, and I've identified 4 broad techniques you can apply to make sure you're not missing something big as you home in on the right mix of medium and content for your project. The first one is work up and down the fidelity ladder. In this example, this is a wireframe, and this is a fleshed out rendering of the same scene. And this is Spider-Man, right? Is that Spider-Man?
Yes.
Okay. Spider-Man here. You might be working in wireframe for a long time, and you might say to yourself, while you're working in low fidelity, you're like, I'm not going to go up to higher fidelity because that's a waste of time. Why would I bother texturing and figuring out how things are going to look and feel before I figured out exactly where everything goes and how big it is and what they're made out of and blah, blah, blah. But let's say you're going for a specific effect, and let's say the effect that you're going for is like, I want the screen to feel really big. And you're like, I'm using these ultra short throw projectors, and they're going to end up being little shorties. They'll only do a screen that's like 5.5 feet tall. And you're banging your head against this. You're like, I'm out of options. I'm out of budget. I'm out of ways to make this better. I don't know what to do. But you've been doing it over here in glasses off Spider-Man world. And just for shits and giggles, because you're frustrated, you take an afternoon and you texture the thing. You start working on it at higher fidelity, and you might realize when you do that, oh, what's the floor condition? How am I going to finish this? If the floor is reflective, and we move the projection down to the floor level so that it meets the floor, this is going to feel much bigger. It's going to be, it's not effective screen real estate, but it might have the feeling of a much larger screen. So that hop in fidelity, which feels premature at that point, might actually be one of the things that breaks you out of uptight thinking, as the dude would say. Number 2, look inside and outside what you consider to be the scope of your problem. So this is one of the games that I'm working on. Ah, nuts, come on. Didn't load? I don't really know. So I'm designing this game, right? And the way the game works is there's a hand tracking device and a light field display. And very simply, you're just trying to make a tower of these virtual objects on the screen using your hands, your virtual hands on the screen, faster than your opponent. I'm working on this thing, and it's for up to 4 players, right? But 2 players can play, even 1 player can play by themselves. And I modeled it out real quick with some freebie furniture that I found, whatever. And remember, I'm sorry, just for context, because we lost the plot here. This strategy is look inside and outside what you consider to be the scope of your problem. In this particular flavor of this thing, right? So like you can see this lady, she's playing by herself, and she's in this awkward position where she's trying to get her hands into the center here. Because that's what you would do, right? When you're playing this game, the screen's right in front of you. You would like, your hands are on this virtual screen. You gotta get your hands in front of the screen. I had originally designed this with 4 of these hand tracking devices, right? And I got these chairs around the thing. And then I started modeling it, and I'm like, well, if you were playing by yourself, you'd be sitting in a chair with your butt squarely on the chair, not on the gap between them. You'd be kind of leaning over. And then I was thinking, oh, this is kind of awkward because the hand tracking devices are over here, so your hands are going to be on 2 devices at once, probably like in the blended field of view between the 2 devices. That's not great. And also, how do I prevent people from just sitting here and putting... I had all these problems with this thing, and I'm trying to solve them with tech. I'm like, okay, well, that's because that's the scope of what I'm working on, right? I'm working on this virtual game. I'm thinking, and now, so I go a little bit outside. I'm like, okay, maybe I'll put some stuff on the screen, right? I'll have some messaging on the screen that tells people where to sit. Or maybe I'll even put a sticker on the table that tells them where to sit. Or maybe I'll try to blend the input from these 2 hand tracking devices so that no matter where their hands go, I can fix it, blah, blah, blah. And then eventually I thought, you know what actually is the problem is these chairs. I was just working it over for a while. I got really frustrated. I stopped for a while, and I thought I'll work on the furniture for this build. I'll work on the fabrication build. And I thought, how am I going to get these chairs made, blah, blah, blah. And then I thought, you know what, if this was just a little shorty bench right here, these 2 players could, if it's a single player, they could sit in the middle. And if it's 2 players, they'd sit shoulder to shoulder, which is good for the camera that's looking at them to catch their picture. And it also means that we can use 1 centralized hand tracking device, which ends up being 2 instead of 4 on the CPU, blah, blah, blah. All my problems went away. My problem was the chair. And the chair was the very first thing I picked, and that I did not consider to be part of my problem domain. All right, third one. Mull it over or chop it up from the start frequently. This is just rubber ducking. It's not going to be news to you, but I can't overstate how useful it is to just explain the entire thing from the start all the way up to your problem to someone new. Very frequently, you'll break out of your problem right away. If you don't have friends, you can use the Artist Pages technique. If you haven't read The Artist Way by Julia Cameron, worth checking out. Basically, you just sit down in the morning, write down 3 pages, stream of consciousness. Very typically, you're going to end up midway through saying, and also I have this problem, and I should probably just, and then you've got your answer. Last, look for constraints and hang on to them for dear life. If anything is open-ended, if your entire thing is open-ended, you're fucked. I wasn't planning on cursing there. But you seriously are, that's the worst thing you could possibly have. So if you find yourself stuck, especially when you're choosing in this medium content loop, look for constraints on space, on light, on power, on your budget, on your setup time, on your design resources, on your licensing, on your compute, name it. Anything you can think of, write down all your constraints, pen yourself in, hem yourself in. Constraints breed creativity. You will have a much easier time getting to the end, the other side of your design process if you are completely hemmed in. That is the easiest kind of design to do. And there are constraints, I promise you. Lastly, bonus, if it gets simpler, you might be headed in the right direction. If you come up with a solution or you start exploring in your gradient descent a path that actually eliminates part of what you're doing, it removes pieces, tech, design, code, externalities, anything like that, that's probably the solution that you should be pursuing rather than the one that adds, rather than the one that requires you to develop new things, to build further, to make your thing more complex. FAQs. How can I find out more about Third Wave? Glad you asked. This is our website, thirdwave.fun. I have a video on there called Making Games in TouchDesigner that is a lot more TouchDesigner centric. It's probably the talk I should have done today, but I've already done it. It's on the internet for free. And I go through in that video quite a bit technically about how you might actually or might not make games in TouchDesigner and whether or not that's a terrible idea. Actual questions. Does anybody have an actual question? Thank you, everybody.